New McDonald's that's currently out of town is not good. But if a fast food restaurant wants to build a new pedestrian-oriented 2 or more story structure, I think by all means we should let them, as long as they meet all the other pedestrian requirements. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Anyone else who would like to speak? Yes, please state your name and address for the record.
Commissioners, my name is Paul Oberstar. I live at 3838 Drew Avenue South in Minneapolis. I own a business at 224 West Lake Street called Paramount Collision Center and have been there for more than 34 years. I also rent space in my building to Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I'm on the record as firmly opposing including Lake Street east of Lyndale Avenue in this pedestrian zoning district. If you look at what's going on Lake Street, anybody with common sense will tell you that it appears everything east of Lake Street, east of Lyndale on West Lake Street, is being red zoned for no development. There has been no development. I just noted the other day that in August, City Planning and Economic Development announced that Minneapolis exceeds $1 billion in permits issued sooner than any previous year on record. We've had minuscule development where we are, and we're adjacent to a major area with significant investment. It is my opinion that creating more barriers on this part of Lake Street is premature and not necessary. And we should wait to see what happens with the Kmart development before we pursue this any further. Thank you.
Right, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Yes, please state your name and address for the record.
Nancy Anderson, 2446 Aldridge Avenue South. I'm a pedestrian. I take the bus, most places, so I walk to get the bus. And 25th and Hennepin, I'm scared to death. 25th and Bryant, I'm scared to death. 25th and Colfax, I'm scared to death. The whole way up there, nobody knows how to stop at a stop sign or do anything. So how is some of this stuff even gonna matter? It's like I'm scared. And the light at 25th and Hennepin, in the wintertime especially, I might not always be able to get all the way across because of ice. Cars are just raring to go. They can't wait to kill me. So I don't know what this is going to do to help that. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Anyone else like to speak? Yes, please state your name and address.
Hi, I'm Pat McGrath, 2733 Girard Avenue South. And I agree with some of the people who are the owners, like the Kmart, and I don't understand what the hurry is to put all these restrictions on. I've lived now in Uptown for 16 years, and I'd like to walk around and see flowers and not just storefronts and a sidewalk. I don't understand why we're doing so many restrictions. You're talking about possibly opening, or don't do so much with what you spent so much time on before. Like communal living, how to define it. Why can't we see what the free market brings? I've seen many restaurants open and close partly because of parking restrictions, and I just think that probably will get worse. And I don't really want to be in a concrete jungle where I'm on this sidewalk and then there's this storefront. Also, we live in a cold weather climate, and can't people have the right to have 4 feet before they start a window? And even from a point of view of danger. I mean, if I owned something on the first floor, I wouldn't necessarily want the front of it to be completely glass, and also just in heating. It takes that much more to pay for heating, and we're also trying to conserve fuel, etc. Why, instead of all this, why don't we talk about green roofs more and put some effort toward that instead of just restriction? Let's see what the free market can bring.
Right, thank you. And is there anyone else who would like to speak? Yes, please state your name and address for the record.
Hi, I'm Tina Johnson. I have a house at 2425 Aldrich Avenue South. And I'm against this proposal because there are no real design guidelines except for the building height and window placement. And I think we need to have design reviews because a lot of the buildings are really not very pretty that they've been approving. They don't go with the neighborhood. This is a historical neighborhood. A lot of people forget about that. Also, I grew up behind an antique shop in California. Parking was very important. We need to have businesses so that people can pull up, buy something, and put in their car and go. Another problem is the sidewalks and street stormwater management. People want to see flowers and gardens and trees, and I think it's a big mistake to add more concrete and more building. And then also, I just wanted to say that they found out that if you have more balconies in buildings, there's less crime because there's people watching more. So I think that would be a nice thing if you are going to be building more mixed type buildings, which I do like that idea where you can have maybe a restaurant on the bottom floor and then the apartments above. And then you've probably seen that Trump Tower in New York. They have like a step back style, and that would be a nice idea, kind of in keeping with the neighborhood, where you wouldn't be so overpowered by great big square building after big square building. Have some of it maybe step back, after like maybe the first floor. Anyway, just if you could just please not take the first contractor that comes along and accept their design. There's a lot of really creative, wonderful architects out there. We don't have to just settle for less. And I think that it's really important. It's a historical neighborhood, and I believe that we really need to think about the overall look of the area so it goes together. So anyway, thank you for listening, and I appreciate your help.
All right, thank you. And yes, please state your name and address.
Good evening, Mr. President, members of the Plan Commission. My name is Andrew Degerstrom. I'm the president of the East Isles Residents Association. Our address is 2751 Hennepin Avenue South, Box 294. And we enthusiastically support this zoning change. So going back to last year, I think around January, we've already talked about several times that Walgreens, we were very disappointed when that came up because we were looking for something that was between 2 and 4 stories mixed use. That was 1 story, single use. So at the time, we're looking at thinking what types of changes in the zoning code would not allow us to go through and require something that we're actually looking for. And what we said at the time was inclusion in a pedestrian-oriented overlay and a minimum FAR standard. And this proposal has both, and so we're very excited about it. In East Isles, our residents, one of the greatest amenities of our neighborhood that we value is walkability, and any changes that is going to help improve walkability, help improve pedestrian safety, this feeling on the street, make the street more welcoming to walk along, we very much support that. We'd just like to thank Councilmembers Goodman and Bender for bringing this proposal forward. Thank you.
Thank you. And anyone else who'd like to speak? Yes, please state your name and address.
I'm Sybil Graffender, and I live at 2448 Garfield Avenue South. I've lived in this neighborhood for 35 years, and I'm concerned about this proposal specifically between Franklin and 28th on Hennepin and Lyndale, because the character of the neighborhood is it's fairly low density. There's a lot of 2.5-story houses, 1-story restaurants and commercial properties. And it's a historical character. So by changing the minimum height and the maximum height specifically, it's going to, I think, force there's a lot of financial pressure on the neighborhood that will cause the buildings to be built up and impact the neighborhood negatively, I think. especially, for instance, I'm on the, I'm not on Lindell, but I'm on the other half of that block. And I know that by building that those properties higher, it'll negatively impact my residents and many of the other residences there. And then finally, I would say I don't think that the neighborhood is generally aware that this is going on. So I think it needs to have more better publicity about what the changes are.
Right, thank you. And yes, please state your name and address for the record.
Hello, my name is Katie Jones-Schmidt. I'm at 2219 Bryant Avenue South. I am very supportive of the pedestrian overlay, except for one thing, really, the windows, the 2-foot minimum, what I find a little strange and kind of arbitrary. I work in building energy, and it doesn't bring a whole lot more advantages in terms of bringing more daylighting in. You actually need more windows at the top of a story that rather than at the bottom to bring more daylight into a building and into a space. And just another thing that, windows have an R value of 1, and typically we like our walls to have R values in the teens, and so that is a lot of heat loss. And since we have really aggressive climate action plan goals, I think we should maybe rethink that a little bit. Thanks.
Right, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak on this item? Well, we should make sure everyone who wanted to speak has an opportunity. Yes, please state your name and address.
My name is Philip Schwartz. I live at 3418 Garfield Avenue. I walk in the neighborhood all the time, and I chose to live in the neighborhood because I really enjoy being able to walk from place to place, explore new businesses, and I think this would only help that. I just traveled to Montreal, and I was able to walk around the city, explore. There weren't parking lots. There weren't single-story buildings. It was just a very nice place to walk around, and I would love to move towards that. And I don't want to see more single-story Walgreens and Wells Fargos in my neighborhood. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? Yes, please state your name and address for the record.
I'm Scott Sansby, and I own the apartment building at Lake and James, 1623 West Lake Street. And I've been at Lake and James for 38 years doing business and living. And I love the concept of a more pedestrian-friendly environment. But I'm seeing more and more buildings, and especially if everything is going to be automatically 4 stories now, more and more units all the time are coming into the neighborhood, and parking is being waived for many of these. And parking lots are now or I'm hearing anyway, parking lots are kind of being taken away. So I'm seeing more and more people, and I think it's an illusion to think that it's the work-living concept where everyone that's living and moving into these places isn't driving and isn't needing a parking place. My tenants have trouble parking other than the few spots that we have in our lot. It's a real issue. I love the concept. I want everything to be more pedestrian oriented, but I think that's also an issue that more density, more development, more places, and waived parking, I think is creating a traffic and parking congestion. Just wanted to point that out. Thanks.
Right, thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to speak? If there is no one, we'll close the public hearing. And commissioners, we have 2 items before us. Commissioner Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wanted to ask staff to come back up to answer some of the questions that were either identified in the written feedback or in the hearing. First, could you talk about the non-conforming properties? We had at least 2 property owners speak during the hearing about the non-conformity of their own properties, but there are more. So could you talk about what it means to be non-conforming in a pedestrian district? And I could add my perspective, but I think it makes sense to start with staff.
Chair Brown, Commissioner Bender. In the staff report, we do note that there's 29 non-conforming uses. We break those down. 10 of those are drive-throughs. 8 of those are gas stations. 8 of those are auto repair, including 2 major automobile repair. That's Paramount is one of those. Hagen's Auto Body is the other. Those are allowed in their C4 zoning and require conditional use and would be prohibited. So those become non-conforming. And automobile sales and 1 car wash, including the car rental, I guess, with that's attached to Paramount. Non-conforming uses have state rights and rights provided by our ordinance, our city ordinance. Those rights allow for the property to remain on site and can continue in operation in perpetuity. We allow those properties to be maintained. So if someone wants to put a new wall up or clean or reskin the building or do that kind of work, they can do that. Put fences up that are in compliance, that kind of work. If someone wanted to add space, they'd be looking at an expansion of a non-conforming use, and there's a process that you see as a planning commission as an application that comes forward. Those expansions, I think the most recent one I'm aware of was actually the Wells Fargo drive-through that's in the project area. So an example of a non-conforming use that was expanded and allowed to continue. They also have rights to, if they're discontinued, so if there's constant continuance, there's no issues. If that discontinuance happens for a duration of over a year, they lose those non-conforming rights. That discontinuance of use typically is somewhere around abandonment. Oftentimes, staff has to work with property owners when a property is being marketed for lease or sale to ensure that those rights, they can work on maintaining those rights as they go forward. I think a lot of times, if you look at the findings for an expansion of a non-conforming use, I don't have those in front of me. If you want, I can try to dig those up real quick. But a lot of that is also looking at coming in further compliance with the other guidance that we have in the plan. So if, for example, a non-conforming use was looking to expand, but wanted to expand it and meet closer to our FAR requirements, and the use was mitigated, there's findings to be made to determine if that's an appropriate project.
Thank you. I think that's helpful. So I would note that both you and I know, did speak with Mr. Oberstar on that particular situation, that it is the use that is non-conforming. And I wanted to note that that was part of the list of things that is in every pedestrian district in the city. And so a change to that would be a change to the underlying rules that reach across the whole city, not just specific to this site. I didn't have a strong feeling about this, but it is part of the overall ordinance. And I'd be happy to follow up with the other property owner who spoke. I do have more questions for you, though. The next one is that I wanted to note that the CARAG comments had some items that I think are just specifically to public works, and that this pedestrian district only covers the private side. It doesn't cover what our own public works department does. So I would just note that. You can comment or not. I wanted to ask you to comment, though, on the idea of encouraging small retail spaces and encouraging walkout housing with stoops, which was part of their comments. And then I just have a couple more questions after that.
Chair Brown and Commissioner Bender, the concept of having more storefronts or smaller uses along streets was something that we discussed along the process. We do govern the size of unit or square footage of commercial space in the base zoning already. We discussed the opportunity of looking at it in different ways. I think ultimately, we feel comfortable with the base zoning. I think there's a conversation. If you want to further incentivize that, that could be an option. But I think some of this is a conversation for today, and I think some of this conversations as we're thinking about the comprehensive plan, some of our urban design policies and how they move into regulation and what we want to accomplish further can be discussed.
Okay, I think that's fair. And then there's a specific comment about right-of-way trees. They should be required to be planted in accordance to best practices. I know we've discussed that many times. So I will just say that seems like a reasonable addition to me, but I wanted to give you a chance to respond to that.
Chair Brown, Commissioner Bender, I think that if you feel it's reasonable, I think it's relatively fine. I think with right-of-way trees, we still look at that when the project comes forward. We look at those locations and how they're planted and how they're maintained is a process that is dealt with both through Public Works and the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, because they are the ones that maintain the trees. So there is some standards about the whole, and how all those pieces come together, and that's usually done through site plan, through the review of the site plan, through preliminary development review.
And then just a couple more things that came from the Lowry Hill East Neighborhood Association's comments. One was some questions about the environmental impacts. I guess if you have any comments about that, I know you responded in writing as well. I would just say that we wouldn't typically do an environmental impact assessment about this kind of policy change. We can talk more about that, but maybe that just could stand. And then the other question was about specific to driveways and parking lots. And the question was, does disallowing driveways on major corridors encourage more traffic on neighborhood streets? And I think that's a good question to ask and one to consider. So wondered if you had any response to that in weighing those specific requirements about curb cuts on our transit corridors and commercial corridors.
Chair Brown, Commissioner Bender, with regard to the last part, which was the curb cuts, we are not prohibiting curb cuts along corridors, only on those properties on corners. So traffic still can access, working with Public Works, working with planning staff on that project to have access to those sites. So we're not requiring that access to be used on the alley. We're not requiring that to go into the streets behind. If it's on the corner, we're asking that curb cut not be allowed, and that's actually generally a discouragement right now. Our Public Works often discourages those uses or those curb cuts, mainly because they do create some traffic concerns. I think the traffic going out into the interior of the neighborhood, I think there's still a lot of vehicles. We haven't modeled that, so I don't have an answer to understand if more cars will make turns into the neighborhood or if they'll go out to the street. But we do have that condition today with a lot of our uses, and a lot of those, I believe, still model to make those turns back into the main corridor of Hennepin or Lindale or Lake. I think that I can't remember the rest of your questions.
I think that's sufficient. I mean, I would say then that also we have site plan reviews come through the Planning Commission for each large development project, so that could be considered project by project as well. Thank you. So I guess I would just note that I think from the testimony we heard, some folks want more regulation, some want less. I think you've brought forward a proposal that kind of tries to hit that middle ground. So I just did want to note that there's been a lot of community discussion in the neighborhoods. Several of the neighborhood organizations have participated. So other commissioners may have more thoughts as we go.
All right. Are there any further questions for Commissioner Magrino?
I have a question for staff. In the last part here about the curb cuts on a corner lot, is there a reason you went with just corner lot generally rather than a specific distance from the corner? Because the lots are all pretty differently sized depending on where you are. Some of them might just be a house, some might be a half block, just depending on where that site lands.
Chair Brown, Commissioner Magrino, yes, there are some sites that actually cover almost 3/4 of the block. We just generally followed the idea that corner lots are corner lots. Sites might be subdivided in the future or worked on. Instead of having a specific distance, that's a reasonable item that could be discussed or revised if that was the Commission's desire.
Okay. Thanks. Great. Anyone else? Well, Commissioner Vreeland, since you had prematurely started a motion, maybe we can have you make a motion. All right, we have a motion to approve A and B, the rezoning study and the zoning code text amendment. Is there a second? We have a second. Is there any further discussion? Commissioner Kronzer.
Yes, I would like to add an item to requirement, I guess. I guess it's under the text amendment under section 551. No, that's not right. Let's reference a page number. The last page of the text amendment would be item 11. And it's regarding to the pedestrian scale lighting that we talked about a little bit tonight and talked a lot about at the last public hearing on some projects. So let me read this and we can discuss. All buildings shall install pedestrian scale exterior lighting mounted on the first story of a building to illuminate the ground plane spaced evenly on all facades facing public streets. And just to say a few words, I live very close to Lindell Avenue. Hennepin Avenue is a very different environment. There are public pedestrian scale lights, I think spaced every 40 feet from Franklin all the way down through 31st. On Lindell, there's none of that, and it's a completely different environment. The building that has World Street Kitchen in, that actually got a Hennepin County grant to put lighting in, and it's a dramatic difference at that corner versus pretty much the entire way up Lindell, up to Franklin. So I think while we're adding a little bit more cost to the development, I think it's well worth that added safety and environment for that pedestrian.
All right. I will take that as a motion to amend the original motion to add an 11th paragraph under the revision to Chapter 551.150 related to pedestrian scale lighting on the first story. Is there a second? We have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion on that amendment? If there is none, we can adopt that amendment on a voice vote. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And that motion carries. Commissioner Vreeland.
Yes, I discussed this. Well, the last time we talked about the window issue, 2 feet still seems too low to me. I think 3 feet or 30 inches. I mean, 2 feet just seems too low. And I think one of the speakers talked about the R factors. And I just think less windows would be broken if they were, if we started out at a little higher height. And I would love to hear my colleagues' thoughts about that.
All right. Commissioner Kranzer.
Yeah, I guess I think the 2 foot's probably about the right mark. If we think about the pedestrian scale, the sidewalk, storefronts, this is a requirement on non-residential buildings on 40% of the windows on that ground floor. So, it's not the entire length. It can be broken up with walls. It doesn't require how tall a window needs to be. I think if we were to go out, take measures and walk down Hennepin Avenue, I think we'd find the average to be really close to 24 inches. We'd have some a little bit above and some a little bit below, but on the lion's share, what's out there today is really close to 24 inches.
Right. Commissioner Lukey-Peer.
Yeah, hi. So I'm kind of torn on this one because I'm a little bit leaning toward 30 inches myself, only because I think of a standard table height. If there's a cafe or something and sitting at a table, and what do you like to see, the inside of a table or not, or I don't know. But I am the reason why I'm leaning more toward 30 inches as opposed to 24 inches is because it's due to the being measured on the adjacent grade, and I just think about certain buildings where there's like a step up into the building and what that really means to where the height of the window is on the finished floor of the interior of the space and where that hits. I do think it's important to keep it lower. I don't think 3 feet is appropriate because I think that's altogether too high to create a friendly pedestrian environment. I don't think it really has to do with energy efficiency at this point as much as it is more of a SEPTED and encouraging pedestrian activity sort of initiative. So I guess I would say if it does get increased in height, I would say don't increase the requirement to more than 30 inches, is because I think that would be detrimental toward creating a positive pedestrian environment. But I think a case could be made to raise it another 6 inches or somewhere in that range.
I'd second that.
All right. And perhaps Commissioner Lukey-Peer, if you'd like to make that a motion, could you restate it a little more succinctly?
All right. As a motion, I'd like to change 551.120, the last sentence of the building facade paragraph to replace the word to parentheses 2 feet, the words I should say, with not more than 30 inches above the adjacent grade, and that should give them that play they need.
All right. We have a motion and a second pertaining to windows. Is there further discussion? If there is none, we can adopt that amendment by voice vote. All in favor signify by saying aye. Any opposed? Maybe we should do a quick roll call vote. Or it's fine. It passed. Yeah, I think we had two voting against it. So okay. Going back to our original motion, is there any further discussion? Commissioner Rockwell.
Just very briefly to the comment that's come up on climate change. I think that's a really important thing to bring up. And this is a case where, to me, there's a balancing act of we have transportation and buildings are two of our two largest emission sources, and so we're trying to address one of those through this. And there's a little bit of a trade-off, and my hope is that this, in fact, is a net gain in emissions reduction. So taking it seriously. Thank you for the comment.
All right. Is there any further discussion? Commissioner Magrino.
I have a question for staff. So I just asked about the corner lot question. So if someone were to come with a land use application that involved, say, 3 or 4 different parcels and one is a corner lot, does the curb cut restriction only apply to the lot that's right on the corner, or would it apply to the whole land use application?
Chair Brown, Commissioner Magrino, it's a good question. I believe it would apply to the development as a whole in the way we treat it, because we treat it as one zoning lot and one part of that process. I can probably ask Jason or Commissioner, it wouldn't Jason if he can identify that, but
that's how I would interpret that as well.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, we have, Commissioner Pender. This is on the original motion. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make a couple of comments on this overall. First, as the folks from the East Isles neighborhood stated, this came about in response to many constituents contacting Councilmember Goodman and I with frustration about specific development proposals in their community that they did not support. And we did not have tools to force the developers to change their projects or proposals. And the pedestrian-oriented overlay district was an existing tool that was in other areas of the city, including Nicollet Avenue and parts of Lake Street, that we could expand to give us more tools to encourage or require developers to put in the kinds of projects that people are telling us they want to see when these proposals come forward. As staff said, this doesn't change anything about what's there today. Only when someone proposes a new building would these regulations apply. So all of the existing buildings, including those that came forward today to express concern about becoming nonconforming, nothing will change about those properties because of this. It would only be for new buildings. And as I mentioned earlier, we got a lot of feedback about this. It is a pretty significant expansion of the district, which covers basically all of the commercial and transit corridors in my ward. And so we really tried to find that sweet spot of regulating just enough so that we had more tools to get the kind of development that people are telling us they want to see, but not over-regulating. And there's still a push and pull. There are still some folks who think we should regulate more and some less. But this will give us the tools that we need to make sure that projects on these really important corridors, where we are seeing the largest scale, most significant developments, really reflect what I'm hearing from the majority of my constituents, which is a desire for those projects to contribute to the character of the community, to support walking and transit use, and so all of these design elements that go along with being pedestrian-oriented in their design. Several folks talked about pedestrian safety more broadly, and there's a lot of things happening at the city that are related to that, but that don't come forward specifically in this land use and zoning proposal. And I'll just note that I am interested in talking more with staff about this tree recommendation that came forward, but I don't want to make a motion without speaking with all of the staff that would be involved in reviewing and maintaining the trees. So I think that's it. Thanks for the opportunity to make those comments, Mr. Chair.
Right, thank you. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, we have a motion and a second to approve both the rezoning study and the zoning code text amendment. Clerk, please call the roll.
Bender?
Aye.
Cronzer.
Aye.
Lipke Pier.
Aye.
Magrino.
Aye.
Rockwell.
Aye.
Slack.
Aye.
Sweezy.
Aye.
Breland.
Aye.
8-0.
And that motion carries. That concludes our discussion on item 4. Our next item for discussion is item 5, the Lowry Hill East rezoning study. Staff is Mr. Schaefer once again. And we saw this at Committee of the Whole not too long ago. Maybe you'd like to highlight some of the changes since that meeting.
Chair Brown, Commissioners, as you mentioned, this is a Lowry Hill East rezoning study. This is a process looking at a reexamination of previous city recommendations from 2004 for areas that are not adjacent to Hennepin and Lyndale, north of 28th Street, and south of Frank, or just north of 20th Street. Those boundaries, one, correspond with the commercial boundaries, but also south of 28th Street, we had the Midtown Greenway land use plan and the rezoning study that followed, so that was our southern boundary. Sure, absolutely. Probably not the only one. No. So again, this item was introduced by Council Member Bender in July of 2016. It picks up with the 2004 CPED recommendations for rezoning. That rezoning study was an 18-month process that began with a moratorium that was initiated in the area. Ultimately, the staff recommendation, the CPED recommendation 2004, was tabled. And so we're moving, we were asked to bring that forward and using the 2004 recommendation as our basis for making these current recommendations. The staff report includes a lot of information about the history of the development, and I'm not going to go and belabor that, especially to the chair's point of getting to this specific changes, but it's just worth highlighting that there has been a lot of evolution in this area, both from policy and from a built environment. And there is, I think what we identified is that there's no singular market force moving towards multifamily housing or single family housing, but there is this kind of a mix and creates an interesting development pattern. The guidance that we're working through is the guidance that's found in the Minneapolis Plan for Sustainable Growth, and the plan really talks about growing in appropriate areas, and the appropriate areas that we talked about growing in our supply of housing are along commercial corridors in this case, which is Hennepin and Lyndale. So we call for high density housing along those areas and medium density housing adjacent to those commercial corridors. That adjacency, I think, has been point of some conversation as we've gone through this, and I'm sure we'll have some conversation about that today. The area that we are covered in is called urban neighborhood. Urban neighborhood is defined as predominantly residential area with ranges of densities. They are not generally intended to accommodate significant new growth, other than the replacement of existing buildings with those of similar densities. And this policy guidance really creates the framework to build upon to create the recommendations we've brought forward to you today. We also look at policies around growing our housing supply and looking at ways of the preservation of existing housing stock. Guidance policy plans are policy about utilizing decision-making criteria when considering demolitions that recognize the value of the original housing stock typically has in the surrounding properties in the communities. One of the key elements about this process is, again, we're building from 2004. Zoning has changed. We discussed this in the Committee of the Whole meeting. I won't go into a whole lot of change, but we can have different recommendations with the same outcomes for different zoning district recommendations with similar outcomes for achievable densities. So what I have before you is actually the proposed recommendations as of that's included in your packet. I will quickly highlight, it's included in the staff report, some of the changes that we're proposing, there's about 7 areas of proposed changes. I'll highlight them. They're again in the staff report starting on page 5. I'll just use the cursor to highlight those areas. These 2 properties along Aldrich, I'm going to follow out a sequence from the staff report, so I apologize for that. At 2119 and 2123 Aldrich, the recommendation in 2004 was to go to to leave these properties R6. Staff was proposing previously to put these at R3, and is now recommending R5 zoning. So those are these 2 properties here. Moving south, this area of yellow that's recommended as R3 is currently zoned R2B. The 2004 recommendations left that area as R2B as well. And our original proposal was to use in 20 or out for 45-day comment was also R2B. We, considering the comments that we received and our idea of using R3 zoning where it's supportable adjacent to commercial corridors, and keeping with the ability to reuse the maximum reuse of these existing properties, R3 zoning allowing for 2.5-story development and a number of units based on the lot area of 1,500 square feet per unit. So we're making a recommendation to go to R3 there. There is a site here on the corner of 24th and Aldrich. Those properties, again, were recommended in 2004 to go to R2B. Or actually, excuse me, R4, and staff was recommending that those now become R3. And our draft recommendation was to keep those as R2B. Again, keeping consistent or trying to be consistent with the 2004 recommendations of going to medium density, using R3, which allows the most flexibility within that 2.5-story built form, and using that built form as a major guidance on how we move forward between looking at medium densities of R3 and R4. Another area of change to identify is on DuPont. This is an area off of 27th and DuPont that is currently zoned R4. Staff was proposing to make that R2B based on the previous 2004 recommendations. Staff is now proposing R3. Which again provides that flexibility within the 2.5-story built form, but it also allows for achieving medium density. One additional space is here along Aldrich, on 27th and Aldrich. There is a couple existing apartment buildings that that the 2004 recommendation was also to go to R4. Because of the existing built form of more of a traditional apartment building, not something that was a 2.5-story structure, but more of what we consider 4 units or more of an apartment building, staff is recommending using R4 here as well. This is a departure from what we saw at COW when we were recommending R2B. So those are just a few of the changes. Again, we're using R3.
I think Commissioner Kronzer has a question.
Brian, I think the map actually says R3 there. That's supposed to say R4.
Chair Brown, Commissioner Kronzer, the map does appear to say R3. The color does R4, and I know that those are changed in the listing of all the properties in the ordinance language to be R4. So I apologize for the labeling of that, but thank you for pointing that out. So with that, I think keep open up for comments, but I just want to identify that, again, we've received a significant amount of comments on this as well. Comments range from concerns about not creating nonconformities, and I can address those quickly in a second on nonconformities. Questions about achieving the type of density in a transit-rich development area that we are today. I think that those are the main concerns that I saw. Regarding nonconformities, it's important to note, we state this in the staff report as well, that many of these buildings that we're proposing will become non-conforming. There's about 90 properties currently that are non-conforming. I go through that. So there's 655 zoning lots or properties within the area. That doesn't include all the duplex or all the condoed out properties. So there are currently about 90 non-conforming properties. These are non-conforming due to the number of allowed dwelling units. So these aren't considered necessarily non-conforming uses. They're not conforming to our standards about density. Our 2004 recommendations resulted in about 109 non-conforming properties.